Hey, Iyad. Thanks for both helping to think of and joining me here today for the conversations on machine behavior that we've now been having with a number of scholars, and you were one of the people who thought of having this series. So it's great to have you here and chat. So one of the things that has recently happened for you is that you've had a massive amount of success on an excellent project that has been running for a number of years in your group, The Moral Machine. And from that has come a large amount of kind of both positive attention for all the work that you've done, the millions of people that you've reached, and the views that you've gotten them to have of that project, and also some notoriety when some people have kind of pushed back a little bit. But that represented a lot of work, especially as somebody who saw a little bit of the internal makings. A lot of work went into that project. And one of the things that I wanted to start off with was, what's next? How does someone move from a really big project like that into doing something else in the academy or just generally in science?
I wish I had an answer. Like I wish I had a formula for how to come up with ideas for more projects. But I think I always found myself kind of doing, in the language of computer science, doing a combination of exploitation and exploration. So on one hand, doing some exploitation of ideas that have already.
How did you see The Moral Machine? Which one did?
Yeah, so let's think about The Moral Machine. The way that it happened was really that I had a collaborative relationship with some psychologists. I have an AI background. We were working on something completely irrelevant to AI, which was social learning on networks. Mm-hmm. But I continue to be interested in developments in AI and how it's going to change the world, and I kept hearing about the autonomous cars making morally charged decisions. Yeah. And then there were lots of articles being written in different venues like the New Yorker and the Atlantic about these difficult questions about how is the car going to make ethical decisions. Mm-hmm. Around the same time, I like to read outside of my field, and I was reading Josh Greene's Moral Tribes. Mm-hmm. So Josh Greene is a psychologist at Harvard who has been thinking, he's also a philosopher, he's been thinking for a long time about how you can use ethical dilemmas from philosophy to find out how regular people think about moral trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And he took this trolley problem from philosophy and subjected it to people, presented it to people and measured, their responses, and even put them in MRI machines to scan their brains while they were making these decisions to see which parts of their brains were firing. So, he learned a great deal about human moral reasoning from those studies. So for me, it was fascinating because it was an experimental way of studying ethics, which is something we think of as something objective,
fixed, given, whatever
given, or
to, yeah.
Exactly, or it's either comes from above or it comes from very smart people who come up with the best rules, sure. For the rest of us to follow. Yeah. But then, as it turns out, as I've discovered the more and more I read, a lot of ethics is socially constructed and it's cognitively constructed, and it's something that is, we learn and we construct as a society as we shape the norms that govern ourselves, and this is why you see a lot of cultural differences between different societies. So anyway, so it was the kind of the confluence of reading those papers about something that I never thought I would run experiments within that field that looked like that, but I was fascinated by Josh Greene's work and also fascinated by AI, and then it clicked at some point that maybe we should do this. We should ask people experimentally what they think the autonomous cars should do in a morally charged situation. So that's how it happened. It was not planned, I guess. Yeah, but the building blocks were there at the right moment, and it all followed.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So one of the things that immediately makes me wonder, since these are conversations on machine behavior, is would you consider the work that you did in kind of evaluating people's ethical preferences around AI, would you consider that to be machine behavior? And if not, what's the intersection there of kind of getting societal preferences around AI's behavior, but
Yep.
how do you draw that distinction?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So, in a way, what we did in the moral machine experiment is we presented people with ethical dilemmas. We described this hypothetical in which a vehicle has to choose between running over one child or two adults. And there's no other choice. You have to suspend this belief just for a bit to force yourself to think about what's the more important value here. Is it protecting young people or saving more lives, for instance? And in this case, there is a machine that is capable of certain moral choice, and then there's a human. In this case, the experimental participant, the person who's playing with the moral machine, has a particular preference about what the machine ought to do.
Yeah.
Now, I think you need both. So initially, I was interested in what do people think machines should do? What are the taboos that machines should never do? What are the general principles? Are they similar to what we expect other people to do in these scenarios, or are they different?
Back out Asimov's laws from people's preferences and things like that?
I mean, so Asimov is a good example of the contrary approach, the counter approach. So
saying explicitly what they are up front.
Exactly. So Asimov comes up with 3 laws of robotics. Robot should not harm a human being, should not disobey a human being, and should not allow itself to come to harm. Mm-hmm. And these are stratified. So the first law is the most important, and then ideally, all the rest of it should just follow from those laws. And of course, that's never the case.
Which is why the book is interesting.
Yes, exactly. But then. In reality, because our norms and laws are ultimately socially constructed through a very long process of cultural evolution and so on, then it's very interesting to hear what people have to say about these questions and to probe them. And we have methods of probing them and of finding out what exactly changes their preference. What exactly causes them to flip the preference, so to speak. Is it a single factor? Is it a combination of factors, and so on? And do these things vary by culture, and so on? And we explore some of these questions in the paper, and we did identify indeed cross-cultural differences and things that are kind of universal preferences, for example, to save young people, and so on. Now, but this is all about what people think the machine ought to be allowed to do, or ought to do, or has an obligation, moral obligation to do in a given scenario. But then this question is meaningless unless you know what the machine is capable of doing in the first place, or what motivation the machine or the makers of the machine have in the first place. So I don't think you can. So you don't really have the full picture without asking both questions. You need to understand if a machine is capable of thinking fast enough about a given scenario. Is it capable of detecting, for instance, if somebody is a child or an adult, right, or if somebody is jaywalking or not? Mm-hmm. Because if it can't, then the other question is completely pointless.
Yeah.
So they complement each other in that sense.
Yeah, totally. So again, a very interesting kind of thought came to mind thinking about AI and ethics. And you could think about asking everyone what their preferences would be with respect to an ethical system, and you could say, would you prefer that we have a system where old people are sacrificed in order to save young people, et cetera, et cetera. You can come up with many hypotheticals like that. But as a social scientist, one of the things that I know is that people aren't necessarily the greatest at, when you ask them on the spot, being able to give you consistent preferences over exactly what they think, even for themselves, the set of rules that they should live their life by should be. Much less for the rules that they would like to apply to everyone else, time consistently, et cetera. Yeah. Is the kind of constructivist way, so are the ethical systems that we have now able to be improved upon? And maybe they're able to be improved upon by surveying people and putting them in game settings and making them play the games, and you figure out what their preferences are, and then you deduce, via the deduction of those preferences, you can come up with rules for the behavior of algorithms or anything else in society. But could you think about just observing people in an unobtrusive way and deducing via AI technologies that we have, via vastly complex neural nets, if the goal is to come up with and generate basically a set of societal norms that is optimal for that society, could we just do that instead of asking people? Can we somehow synthesize a moral system and a system of right and wrong that is basically just based on a really, really complex algorithm that uses all the data available?
I mean, in principle, I don't see why not. I mean, the thing is, but then there are limits to these approaches as well. So I think, look, I don't think the moral machine or any survey for that matter can give you, the only piece of information that you need to be able to build an ethical AI. Yeah. It just gives you one perspective. It gives you, it basically tells you what an average person thinks a programmer should program a machine to do in a given scenario. But then what an average person thinks may violate fundamental human rights, for example. Right? So one of the things we found is that people prefer to save individuals with higher status over, like, let's say, a homeless person. Mm-hmm. I would say many people would object to this, even though they may express that preference when asked in an anonymous survey, but they may object to living in a society in which that is the case. So this is why we have a social contract in which we find other mechanisms, such as governmental constitutions of countries that protect fundamental rights. We also have legislature and people who think very deeply about these questions, and they integrate to some extent the preferences of the public. They are ultimately a reflection of the norms of society, but they also override some of the public opinion on some issues. And the complex how this process works and how the lawmakers negotiate all of the differences between different groups of people who believe in different versions of society. That's a process that is much more complex, and I don't think something like a survey can replace that. But can machine learning be used to infer people's preferences in a more reliable way because it's more reliably able to detect their hidden motives rather than their expressed motives that they might want to project to others? I think, of course, there's a lot of potential for that.
You could learn a lot from what people type into their Google searches.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. If you ask them explicitly, they may give you a different answer. But when they search for information on their own, that may reflect a different kind of preference. You're right.
Classic social desirability bias. So, all right. So that's kind of the collective and bulk study of preferences around what people think AI should be. How are you thinking about conceiving of the study of what AI is and perhaps even what AI could be? I'd like to talk a little bit about why you think machine behavior, as we've conceived of it, which is kind of the use of tools from the behavioral sciences to study algorithms, is useful. I mean, why have it at all? Why should we do this as opposed to just solve all of the problems via analytic closed form solutions?
Yeah, I guess this is kind of the question comes, is at the crux of why do we need to call this thing a machine behavior, and why should we invite other people to study it?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is that machines are now capable of things, of making decisions of consequences that are broader than their immediate use, and that impact other people. What economists term externalities, which could be positive or negative, and these a lot of these decisions have features and characteristics that are not really the domain of study for computer scientists. So a computer scientist can tell you if an algorithm for scheduling trains is optimal, and because it minimizes waiting time for the average commuter, for instance. And because that's a precisely definable problem that is defined, can be defined in the mathematical frameworks that computer scientists are used to using. But then there are other things, like is an algorithm that is sorting through CVs racially biased? Or is an algorithm that is serving news somehow exploiting or manipulating the opinions of the person who's receiving those news? These are questions that are very difficult to answer, obviously, but they're also outside of the purview or the skill set of a typical computer science education, which I had. So in my case, when I wanted to explore some of these questions, I had to work with psychologists and cognitive scientists. For instance, when we built an algorithm with Jacob Crandall, who was also interviewed, to play games that give players the opportunity to act selfishly for individual benefit at the expense of the group. There are very sophisticated algorithms. Computer scientists have studied how these algorithms play these games together, but once you have the algorithm play with people, then understanding the behavior of the algorithm is really difficult without the assistance, that's what we found, without the help of behavioral scientists who understand these types of games and how humans play them.
The system became very complex by
That's right.
using humans.
So I think, the goal is to invite people from other fields to study the machines the way that they study people, and to simplify this process for them. And that's kind of the main proposition.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I'm going to push this a little bit to maybe a weird dimension, but just to kind of get it out there. So let's say we've done some machine behavior for a while, and right now the whole field is relatively nascent, but let's say it's 30 years, 40 years later. And right now we're doing dumb studies. We're like, what's the outcome of the CV rating algorithm? And it looks like it has this descriptive outcomes. And it's not necessarily dumb, it's useful, but it's very basic relative to what it potentially could be. Now, instead of just CV scoring algorithms in 30 years from now, what kind of algorithms are we going to be dealing with? And why, if you think that it's important now, do you think it will be more important 30 years from now to have this type of approach to the study of AI? And what would that look like? What kind of algorithms are we going to be dealing with 30 years from now, possibly? And how much of a role will machine behavior-like approaches play in understanding them?
30 years is a long time, so
It is. Well, come on, I'm 50 then. How about that?
Yeah, so this is the thing. As a computer scientist, I always get asked these questions to imagine, or predict what the machines can do in 5 years or 10 years or 50 years. And I think
Nostradamus. I thought that's what being a computer scientist meant.
So I think, or you could say, no, we don't imagine the future, we build it, right? That's
exactly. But if you build it, then you kind of imagine it. And
but I would say that a lot of computer scientists who built smart, clever algorithms didn't anticipate all of the uses of those algorithms.
True.
So, but I think this is precisely why people like you, who come from the behavioral sciences and are crucially important, because I think I'm limited as a computer scientist. My imagination is a little bit limited because I'm always thinking about the technical constraints on what type of data can be used to train the different algorithms. What sort of training environment can I use for reinforcement learning algorithm, and so on. And that limits what I guess what I can anticipate and the kinds of problems that I might study. So I might be worried about that this algorithm may behave or misbehave in this particular way. But then you, as a political scientist, you're trained at thinking about how actors in a political system may behave or misbehave, and what sort of incentives can shape their behavior, and what sort of group, let's say collusion behavior can take place, and kind of election manipulation is something that you as a political scientist study. So I think you have a much more vast imagination when it comes to these things, and it's by combining. So I would ask you the question, what do you think the algorithms can potentially do in a political system? Let's say, and it's already happening, these things, but let's move 10 years into the future. What could machines potentially do to an election?
Well, maybe let's think about it this way. If algorithms are becoming increasingly personalized, why can't I download an app that tells me whom I should vote for in my local elections, for example. So it's a very low information environment. Politically, I bet that not many of us in here know who our local politicians are, and that's just pretty common in the US. We go to the polls, and on the polls you have a ballot. And on that ballot, there's a list of people, maybe you've heard of 2 names, and the rest of the 20 you've never heard of before. So you download an app, and the app is telling you, okay, well, given from what I've seen about your Facebook news feed and your Twitter feed and the people that you know, the emails that you've sent, I think that you'd prefer to, vote for Judy Johnson rather than Ron Smith. And so now you have algorithms telling people how to vote. That's perhaps pretty interesting, but how do you know what the systemic effects of those algorithms would be when employed in a democracy? There's a few things you can think about. For example, having that actually reduces the cost somewhat of voting, because now you don't have to sit at a ballot and either read through the actual ballot book, which as far as I know, nobody actually does, or kind of like, well, I'm going to vote for this person just because there's some party signal. We know that people respond to party cues. Or there's no party signal, and so I'm just randomizing. There's a psychic cost associated with that, of not knowing and not feeling like you have any confidence in the vote that you made. So maybe the cost is reduced a little bit. Or maybe there are algorithms that help us they vote for us. So you don't even have to fill out the ballot anymore, and it's all vote via the internet, not even via mail. And what are the consequences of that? How do politicians iterate the campaigns that they run to generate content on social media that then subsequently influences the algorithms that help people? You can't study any of that without machine behavior.
And and you're saying that from your perspective as a political scientist, you can study this question purely at the behavioral level.
I don't know that you could study it. I mean, so when I say behavioral level, I think you've defined it pretty broadly, and we talk about it pretty broadly. I would say you couldn't really answer the question without a really substantial knowledge of computer science, as we understand it today, and also a really substantial knowledge of how to do observational causal inference in the way that the social sciences do it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. There are interesting examples like that. I know you're a big fan of watching Black Mirror, right? Yeah. And so they talk about all kinds of weird examples. From one episode, for example, there was the episode where it was like you'd go on a date with somebody, and the algorithm would tell you how long you had to date that person for. Like, oh, you have 36 hours. You have 3 years. Did you see that episode?
Yes.
So I don't know. Putting it back to you. That's what the world looks like, because all of a sudden that reduces the cost to dating substantially, and it's costly to have agency, and it's costly to make decisions for ourselves, so we outsource them.
Yep.
How do you see machine behavior playing a role in kind of understanding a world like that?
Because I guess what I find fascinating is that you can engage with these questions as a political scientist without really caring, without asking the question of how is the algorithm implemented. Like, you don't care if it's using some rule-based system or a neural network or who knows what the next big thing is going to be. All you care about is what sort of intervention, what sort of actions can this algorithm take in the world. For example, giving people a prediction, some piece of information or some advice, on who to vote for or whatever. Yeah. All you need to know is kind of what it can do, and then you can start studying the kind of systemic consequences of that. And I think that's very liberating, because then you don't have to be confined by the mechanics of it.
Yeah.
In the same way that we can study collective behavior of animals without knowing everything, every little detail about their physiology. So do you find this as a social scientist, and I'm asking you this question, even though I know that you've subscribed to this already, but what pushback do you think social scientists might and behavioral scientists might give us as we try to promote this agenda to them? Like, we invite them to study algorithms. What do you think they might have reservations on?
My hunch is that the pushback actually is much more likely to come from computer science than social science. I think the social scientists that I know, and that's many of them that work in a broad variety of the social scientific fields, are all very concerned about the question of what are algorithms doing to humans and human development and human social systems and politics. And there's really not much concern about turning the tools that we have developed as social scientists to the question of what are algorithms doing, as opposed to, an example from political science, for a long time we've asked what are the effects of institutions on political outcomes. And all that institutions are a formal set of rules that interact with social systems and human behavior to produce a set of outcomes. So I don't actually anticipate a whole lot of blowback about, hey, what's the effect of humans interacting with a formal set of rules that mediates what they do in their life? I actually see it much more likely, and you're the computer scientist here, but I see it as more likely that we will receive pushback from computer scientists, and perhaps from people who are not necessarily empirical social scientists, but those who are kind of concerned more from the humanities perspective about, well, if you don't really look into what the algorithms are and how they're constructed and things like that, maybe you're missing some important features of the justice related to the way the algorithms are designed. Now, I would argue that most of that is just captured in the output anyway. But
Excuse me. So I think having spoken to a lot of computer scientists about these questions, I feel like there are two types of pushback. So, of course, many computer scientists understand that a lot of AI behavior and its impact on the world are no longer computer science problems. Mm-hmm. They require an interdisciplinary approach and many people from different fields. But the people who sort of push back I would say they use two kind of different arguments. One is that you have to understand the internal workings of the algorithm in order to make any statement, of value about its impact on the world, because and I find this argument a little bit insincere, because this may indeed be the case for some questions, but it can't be the case for all questions. For some questions, it doesn't really matter. I don't need to understand the details of, let's say, an autonomous car. I don't need to understand deep learning to tell if a car is obeying traffic law. Right? I could just look at its behavior, just like I look at the way a human drives, and and we have systems of testing human drivers without looking into their brain circuitry. Yeah. So, but maybe for some other questions, it may be crucial, and then for those questions, you may have to work with a computer scientist to explore them.
So on that point, I think your response is exactly how I see it. There's a point that I would make, which is, in order to change those systems, if they have undesirable properties, you might need to know how their structure is and what of their structure is likely causing that particular property. But that's a second order. That's a second order question.
And maybe some problems are unfixable because algorithmically it's just impossible to create the behavior that you require. Maybe there are different kinds of fairness metrics in this algorithmic decision making, and maybe some of them are incompatible.
You just can't solve them all at once.
Yeah. So the other thing is also that this notion, and maybe it's a bit more naive, it's this idea that this kind of pushback from computer scientists that no, we're just going to optimize it. So so there's this kind of this sometimes and I would say only naive computer scientists would take that position, but it's this notion that there is something optimal that is objective in the world. So you can basically, if only you could give me enough data and infinite computational resources, I can optimize society. So basically, humans don't need to do anything.
You can just deduce the perfect morality
That's right.
from first principles.
Exactly, and then you just press a button, and then everything runs, optimally. Mm-hmm. And it's a very, I think it's a point of view that comes from a very specific way of looking at the world. That the world is, there are a set of options. There are objective criteria for selecting among those options, and maybe those options are very, very combinatorial and very, very vast. Mm-hmm. But if you have enough data and computational power, you can go through them, and then you can pick the best one. But then that completely, obviously, dismisses the fact that we don't even have an clear objective function that defines what type of values we care more about as a society. Yeah. This is why we need politics. This is why we disagree, and some people have very strong disagreements and about certain laws, and
there would be no political science if we just had a clear objective function in which everyone shared the same objective function, and you didn't have to.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I mean, to use kind of a simple case of, let's say, autonomous vehicles, right? So just as a illustrative point, so you could say that if my objective is to just reduce the number of accidents, that's a fairly clear, quantifiable objective, and then you can give it to a computer scientist who engineers or an autonomous car engineer, and they can build the car, and as long as they bring that number down, everybody's happy. But suppose that you reduce all accidents by half, but the people who die are only cyclists, or only children, or only black people. I mean, then clearly many people would have objections, very strong objections to this, that pure numbers are not, reduction in the number of casualties is not the only value here. There are other values that we care about. For example, protection of certain minorities, or some sort of sense of fairness or equity that we value as a society, because once we give that up, everything else gets worse. So it's this type of dialogue that you need to have with other social scientists and behavioral scientists and with people from the humanities as well, to recognize that the complex process of the construction of value and the negotiation of value. So, which is something that is much more of a political science problem.
I agree. The sentiment that you can just you'll just solve the social sciences with some math is something that some social sciences have tried a little bit to relatively limited predictive success. So, I mean, okay. So it may be the case, as far as I can tell. Now, obviously, this is not fully predictable, but that some of the pushback that we are more likely to get may come from the computer scientists who just think this is dumb. Why would you need to study the behavior? You can just fix it. Yeah.
And I do look. I agree that with some systems you can prove properties of those systems without looking at the behavior. So you can you could prove with very simple algorithms. You could prove how much time a sorting algorithm would take, or how much time a learning algorithm would take to learn, from a data set of a certain size. There are very clever computer scientists working on these problems, and you can give precise answers to them.
Critically, the more complex that it gets, though, the harder it is to do any of those closed form.
That's right.
Solutions.
Yeah, and I would argue that even a system, like a self-contained system like an autonomous car already has so many parts, like unreliable sensors that are not perfect. You have vision systems that have imperfect detection and classification of objects, and all sorts of things. Let alone a system of autonomous cars that's kind of a dynamic, mishmash with humans in the loop that are also interacting with the system.
That's then a function of all human preferences and the profit motives of the companies that are making the cars and all that. Yeah.
So it's really more. I think what our ultimate goal is really kind of studying the ecology. Right, the ecology of all of these things. It's the ecology of human-machine systems that are large and complex, and that frankly, we have very little understanding of so far. Yeah. And I would say, I don't know. Do you think has the ecological approach had much currency in political science? I'm curious, because I think we need both as we study machine behavior.
I think the most accurate answer is no. I think political science as a field, and arguably economics as well, have become increasingly focused on, I guess there are people who work in macroecon, and there are some similarities with general equilibrium modeling and some of the stuff that ecologists do, but a lot of the best empirical work in the social scientists tends to focus a bit more on trying to narrow down specific questions to precise things and say, okay, well, if you just change the institution just this one little way, what's the effect on the outcome that you care about? Which is not really quite the same as especially kind of some of the mathematical ecology that's done and kind of really trying to understand population level dynamics. I think that the social sciences could be strengthened pretty heavily by the inclusion of more consideration of population level dynamics and really trying to think more about the complex systems that exist. Problem is, it's really hard. It's really difficult to make those specific to make those tractable and to be able to really be sure that you got the right answer to any particular empirical question. So it's a bit of a trade-off.
So I've got a question for you now, which is stems from an idea that I'm obsessed with, that future government is going to be increasingly algorithmic, in the sense that a lot of decisions that are being taken today by bureaucracies that are made up of professional bureaucrats, experts, and their consultants are as part of the machinery that is the government, right? Which is the sovereign, right, over the people, but it derives, at least in democracies, it derives its legitimacy from the people, so that this social contract and this sovereign entity, which Hobbes called the Leviathan, is kind of exercising its power to collect information, combine information, make decisions, and coerce people sometimes to accept certain decisions, such as where we're going to build a road, where we're going to put a hospital, what we're going to set the speed limit at, which may inconvenience some people but protect more other people, and so on. So as we go further and further into the future, I think more and more these decisions are going to be made by algorithms that are optimizing for different things. And my question for you is, as a political scientist, is how do you envision the legitimacy of these entities, of this algorithm or machine-augmented bureaucracy or government being accountable to the public? Is it because in some ways today's bureaucracies are also kind of black boxes. They're we don't understand a lot of how they work and function, but we can change them once in a while. We can vote the government out and so on.
Yeah.
We can we can express our views on social media or on conventional media. We can write letters to people and so on. We can lobby. What does that look like? How do you anticipate that looking like in a machine age?
It's a very interesting question. I think that the output of algorithms is still going to be a political output, right? So governments do things that are political. And if people don't like the things that governments do and threaten to vote the people that are in power out of power, then they either get voted out or they change the behavior to some degree, right? So I'm not sure necessarily that it matters all that much how the decisions are being made for legitimacy, because if we're frank, a lot of especially in a lot of Western democracies currently, many of the decisions that are made because particular special interest groups have been able to influence the politics to get decisions that are made in their interest at perhaps the cost of the general public. And the general public is aware of this, and there's a large crisis of legitimacy in many Western democracies, et cetera. So it's not necessarily clear to me that it's a function of how the decisions are made as opposed to what decisions are made and how much people care about the specific decisions that are made. So if let's say the example you gave, the roads, you have an algorithm that's determining where we need to site a new road because traffic's bad, and so the algorithm's going to determine the lowest cost place to site the new road. If there aren't really any substantial political objections to that, and perhaps it then becomes actually a function. Like if I'm a politician and I'm building an algorithm, I want it to actually not just solve the most efficient way to place that road, but I also want it to solve what's the way to place that road that's going to be most likely to keep me in office, right? So I think it's very unlikely that we will end up in a future world in which unbiased algorithms are making these decisions in an impartial way. I think into that algorithm will go, hey, how do you also keep me subject to the constraint of keeping our party in office or keeping the current? So I'm a little bit pessimistic about that. But if those are made by algorithms, perhaps people are uncomfortable with that. But people also don't pay much attention to most decisions that governments make unless they affect them negatively, and it's mostly about the output rather than the process.
So I guess one way we could look at that is that the outputs of the algorithm themselves, or let's say not the outputs, let's even say the objective function of the algorithm that the algorithm is trying to optimize becomes the contested political
Yes.
object.
Yeah, and it will be a function of the political process itself,
Yeah.
right? And that's maybe something that that's certainly something that a lot of computer scientists that I've interacted with don't really make that step, which is everything is a function of the political process, as I see it, at least. I'm a little bit biased because I'm a political scientist.
But that's a nice thing, right? Because then we sort of separate, we have kind of a clear separation between the objective function and the algorithm that optimizes for that function, right? So you could say our job is to express our preferences to an algorithmic system, and then the algorithm is going to find the optimal way, subject to the constraints of achieving those goals, whatever those goals are.
Yeah.
And we could be a society that cares more about this kind of fairness than that, or more about cost reduction than fairness and whatever. And kind of separating those two, do you think would be a useful thing? And has it been useful? Like, are there examples in politics where that separation was done well or not well?
I mean, it's very useful to have, I think, general checks on decision-making powers of governments, and I don't think it's really, it's very rarely, if ever, the case where you have decisions that are made that are just, fully not functions of the political process itself. Now, maybe so there are some examples where the idea is you put something in place for a really long time so that it's not subject subsequently to the political process. So in the US, the Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, for example. So the idea is that they should then not be really particularly worried about the political process because their job doesn't depend on it anymore. But yeah, I mean, it's gonna be the case that as you put it, the constraints into that objective function are going to always be determined by a political process to some degree or other. Mm-hmm. And most of the time it's going to be determined by those people who have the power in the present to shape what the inputs are into that. Perhaps a really interesting question for you is relating to those algorithms themselves. If algorithms in the future are really complex and they're really accurate and they're, use massive amounts of data, it's going to be easier to manipulate the constraints of those algorithms or the features of those algorithms in a way that changes the outcome to favor whoever is in control of the architecture of that outcome. In other words, it might actually be a feature of machine behavior could be tracking the ways that people change the architectures of algorithms to see how the output changes as a function of their decisions to build the thing, because those are going to be endogenous to the preferences of the person who's building or hired to build the thing.
Okay, so this is like, I guess what you're talking about is kind of the algorithmic equivalent of gerrymandering. So you have as a politician, you have the power to manipulate some parameters of something, which then, as a consequence, puts you at an advantage. And this thing, could be. Example. Yeah, so it could be like what the voting, county lines are, or it could be the, I don't know if that's a technical term, but
the districts. Yeah.
The districts. But with an algorithmic decision-making system, it could be, will this algorithm optimize to make my constituency the happiest and maximize my chance of being re-elected? I think that's fascinating, and it would require a fairly technically sophisticated I guess, politicians to be able to recognize that you could make those connections, or maybe...
Or the ability to hire technically sophisticated computer scientists to tweak the algorithms to produce those outcomes.
So then, as a consequence, do you think that then the kind of our checks and balances, our architecture would also require technically sophisticated, let's say, bodies that inspect the conduct of government, that audit the decisions made by governments and their processes and so on, and where would that be?
That's fascinating. There's been a big push in a lot of, maybe not that successful, but at least a big push in a lot of democracies to really try and make bureaucracy more transparent and government decision-making more transparent and records more transparent. If algorithms are increasingly doing decision-making in bureaucracies and those algorithms are increasing in their complexity, then that is going to systematically reduce the degree to which that's transparent to the average citizen.
Yeah.
And I mean, the only way then to have a check on algorithmic governance is to have a effectively separate government body that is separate from the normal political process, that is elected separately, that is somehow not influenced, I don't know how you do this, not influenced by the normal political process, that then checks to make sure that the algorithms that are being used are not being manipulated in ways that are going to create the equivalent of gerrymandering of the future.
I guess that it's a tough problem. Yeah. So I think that this architecture of government is going to become probably ever more complex because
it's going to have to be an algorithm itself.
Because pure transparency, just showing what decisions the algorithms have done may probably create other problems. Like I remember reading a few years ago an article by Larry Lessig, like a brilliant constitutional scholar at Harvard, and the title I think was "Against Transparency" or something like that. And for Lessig, he was giving examples of transparency sometimes stifling consensus, because sometimes politicians would be inside rooms, entertaining ideas that may be, infuriating to their constituents, but they need to discuss these things in order to reach an agreement with their political rivals. For example, to reach agreement on some kind of, to reach enough votes on some political decision.
Right.
And
there's a sausage-making process that is involved in doing politics that.
That's right. So I guess what would, how much do you think that something similar will be required? Some kind of discretion or care has to be made so that the algorithmic sausage making within politics does not sort of get become transparent in a counterproductive way to other algorithms that are doing the checks.
Yeah.
For instance.
I don't have an easy solution to this. It's a massively hard problem to design, because effectively what this recurses to is the design of an institution that is then robust to increasingly complex algorithms that are all being manipulated for particular political gain. And so the how exactly decisions are being made are somewhat opaque. I'm a political scientist. I don't know how to solve this problem. I don't need to think about it.
Okay, so
but I would say it clearly falls into the purview of machine behavior. Definitely. So as we've been kind of going back and forth and talking about how to conceptualize the study of machine behavior and what frameworks to draw on, you had the very interesting idea of pulling from the biological and ecological sciences and the material that they have come up with over time to sort of help frame this study. And I thought that was very interesting. Why not just let some social scientists solve the problem de novo, or perhaps even computer scientists? Why pull from biology to help answer these questions, and what can they help with? Why were you so insistent on thinking about this framework?
Well, I think I think that the biologists have really, and specifically the people who founded the field of ethology and animal behavior, which is really kind of the precursor to today's fields of ecology, which study entire systems of animals and at the behavioral level, have really tried, they thought very hard on classifying the fundamental types of questions about the behavior of animals that is independent of species. So they already kind of tried to classify the important questions independent of whether it's a bird or a fish or a giraffe. That there are types of questions that we might want to ask about the behavior of any biological organism. And these classifications, I think, are extremely helpful precisely because they are general. Now, it doesn't mean that they are, and because they're general, they actually influenced a lot of the behavioral scientists who study human behavior, whether or not they admit that. So I think this framework is helpful in two senses. On one hand, because it's so broad, it may also apply in many ways to the study of machine behavior. But I think it also provides us with something that we can contrast the study of machine behavior with, so that we can be a bit more precise about what is it about machine behavior that is different from the behavior of a human or an animal or some other biological organism. Mm-hmm. So I think it provides a useful organizing principle, but also a good thing to contrast against.
Yeah.
So it provides a nice sort of straw man to clarify clear, important differences against. So, one example is that biologists like to distinguish between the immediate cause of a behavior. So, if an animal sees a predator, then they have a flight or fight sort of reflex, right? And that's kind of the immediate cause or the proximate cause of that behavior. And you can characterize different kinds of these behaviors in different species, and including in humans, right? But then you can also ask about the kind of the long-term benefits of the behavior, not the immediate cause. What causes this behavior to evolve in the first place? And obviously, then you get into evolutionary processes, that this behavior is adaptive, for the individual, but also maybe adaptive for the species as a whole to adopt this particular behavior, given that it lives in a specific environment with specific kinds of predators and so on. So biologists found this distinction very helpful, and I think we may be able to use this kind of distinction, for instance, in understanding machine behavior. So you could, for instance, ask, what is the cause? Why is this particular algorithm showing this particular human a political advertisement? What is driving its immediate behavior? Maybe it's trying to optimize for ad revenues for specific types of ads for specific clients that happen to be in the ecosystem now, right? But you can also ask a question of why did this specific way of optimization emerge in the ecosystem of online advertising, which is a very complex business, very complex ecosystem, billion-dollar industry. So, and it could be that there were certain kinds of actors that favored certain algorithms to be successful in the marketplace, and these were copied. And this is not going to mimic biological evolution. Obviously, it's going to look different. But I think it may be useful for us to think about how different it might be. And in this context, we could also start thinking about kind of the relationship between the algorithms and the people that they are serving. So clearly, the people who are clicking on ads and whose opinions and political opinions and moods are being influenced by these algorithms are an important part of the ecosystem. And there are interesting relationships that are evolving and kind of emerging between those species, that those algorithms serving news and advertisements and the people responding to them. So in a way, you could even ask, and I don't think we have the science to even describe this yet, but you could even ask questions about, in this ecosystem of algorithms serving news to us and serving advertisements to us, what is the kind of dependency between them and the humans? And are we already, in a way, kind of a prey, or are they parasites on us?
Yeah, host-parasite dynamic
of some sort. Exactly. Do we have a predator-prey dynamic? Are they predators? Trying to catch us in a moment of weakness where they can hook us into a specific, to switch our views from one area to another. Are they parasites just interested in us clicking? So there are kind of different levels of abstraction in which you could study those systems that can benefit from this biological metaphor, and important places where they differ in important ways from biological organisms. But we could already, in a way, be living in the matrix, in the sense that these algorithms are they want to multiply and they want to succeed, and they want the companies that operate them to succeed and multiply and gather more resources and therefore control more of the market share. And we are simply the
meat
that's kind of being hooked into this matrix and being manipulated by them, right? So the matrix doesn't have to be this immersive environment necessarily, although that could happen too. But it could already be here, in some sense. And I think that's a very interesting kind of question that you could ask at the species and kind of population dynamics level.
So the question is, can machine behavior allow us to figure out whether or not the matrix is already here?
That's a very interesting question.
Thanks for chatting with me. I appreciate it very much.
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I look forward to continuing to work on these projects with you.
Likewise.